My name is Amy Parker. I am 36 years old and I live in Westchester, Ohio. I'm from Butler County, Ohio, born and raised. Um, my addiction started at a very young age. Around the age of 14, I was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, which is a pretty severe mental health issue. And I was also diagnosed as an addict by the time I was 15 years old. I had been prescribed all kinds of different antipsychotics and antidepressants to try to stabilize my mood or change the chemistry in my brain so that I wasn't thinking impulsively all of the time or making risky decisions or acting out and having behavioral issues. When I was 15, I had several knee surgeries, and the surgeon would prescribe a continuing prescription for Vicodin, whether I was in pain or not. And because it came from a doctor, my mother and I thought that I was supposed to take the medicine as directed on the prescription bottle, which was one tablet every 4 to 6 hours as needed. And we must not have read as needed clearly enough, because by the time I was 16 years old, I was completely submerged into the lifestyle of a person with substance use disorder. I had dropped out of high school because of behavioral issues, fighting physically, a lot of verbal altercations, a lot of issues with authority figures. And because I didn't stay in high school, I didn't get the social interaction that I needed. I think as a young adult, I didn't understand how to communicate with people. I didn't understand how to deal with my emotions. And it's hard to be a teenager regardless whether you have a mental illness or substance use disorder or not. As many of us know, our teenage years were some of the hardest years. But because I had all of these extra issues to deal with, that made life that much more difficult for me to deal with on a daily basis. Because I had experienced treatment with mental health and had been prescribed so many medications, antipsychotics and antidepressants, and the result of all that medication, I had gained about 150 pounds in less than 6 months. And so because of those side effects, I didn't want to take the medication any longer. It wasn't really helping me that I could tell, and I was still, having all of these behavioral issues and living a very risky lifestyle. So instead of taking the prescribed medication, I completely stopped the medication and I began to self-medicate with illicit substances like marijuana, which quickly led to me meeting a whole different demographic of people than what I'd been used to. I'd been used to this small town, Trenton, Ohio lifestyle where everyone knew everyone. And that hadn't worked out for me because in a small town where everyone knows your business, everyone knew me to be the crazy person. And I think many of my friends look back and I was the only person with addiction that they knew at that time. And so by the time I was 18 years old, I was frequently sneaking into bars in Cincinnati or in Oxford, Ohio at Miami University. I was drinking underage, and because of the people that I had gotten close to, I was being offered substances that I had never done before. So I started using cocaine, ecstasy, crystal meth, ketamine, which back then was called Special K. Anything and everything that was presented to me, I would use without question, without fear, because I was constantly trying to escape whatever state of mind I was in at that moment. And typically the state of mind that I was in was a very depressed state of mind, high anxiety, feeling as though I didn't belong anywhere, especially in my own skin, and not understanding that I had created this path for myself because I didn't know anywhere else to go. My family had started to get really tired of my behavior. I wasn't an easy person to deal with. I was really difficult to get along with. I lied constantly. Everything that I would say or do was always in manipulation in order for me to get what I wanted, whether it was the drug that I wanted at the time or money to be able to purchase the drug that I wanted at the time. And at that time, it wasn't a specific drug of choice for me. It was any drug. I wouldn't consider that I had become physically dependent on opioid pain medicine quite yet. But by the time that I was 21 years old, I found myself pregnant with my oldest daughter while using crack cocaine, crystal meth, really, again, anything that I could get my hands on. But I eventually ended up with kidney stones when I was about 7 months pregnant with my oldest daughter, and I was hospitalized. And in the hospital, I was given IV Dilaudid, which is a very, very powerful and strong opioid pain medicine, a synthetic opioid pain medicine. And I remember that feeling the very first time I had ever had an opioid enter into my body with that route of administration of injection. I had taken pills before. I had never snorted an opioid to my knowledge, but I'd never felt that feeling before. And from that moment, my addiction to opioid pain medicine began, and it began very strong. So much so that by the time I was ready to deliver my daughter, while in the middle of labor, in the middle of pushing, I stopped pushing and demanded that they give me more Dilaudid or morphine before I was willing to continue labor to deliver my child. And I used whatever physical excuse that I could come up with to go see another doctor to obtain another prescription of pain medicine. And within just a few months of delivering my child, I had seen a dozen different doctors and had obtained a dozen different prescriptions for Vicodin or Percocet. By the time that my daughter was approaching a year old, my father and my stepmother came to me and requested that I sign my rights away to her so that they could care for my daughter, because I had basically abandoned her to my parents. I was out partying again and doing all of the same behaviors and patterns that I was doing. And I had really only stopped those patterns and behaviors for just a couple of months within the pregnancy. And I was angry and I was offended that they wanted me to sign my rights away to my child. That's my child. And I didn't understand it then, because I was deep within the disease of addiction, that I wasn't caring for my child. I wasn't paying for anything that she needed. I wasn't providing child care for her. I wasn't even staying home at night to take care of her. So in essence, I wasn't even her mother. I had given birth to her, and then I basically left her with my parents to raise. And reluctantly, I agreed to sign my rights away to my daughter. Very quickly, life spiraled down and out of control, and I began a very dark and dangerous journey running away from myself, which is impossible to do. I was running away from the guilt and the shame for not being a good mother to my child, for leaving her to my parents to raise. And even though it was a very loving and safe and nurturing environment, I left my child. And to add to that, because of my risky behavior and lifestyle, she didn't know her biological father. So because of my choices, that's what I did to my child. The one person that I'm supposed to take care of no matter what, I just left. And that's how strong the disease of addiction was for me. And so for many years, I continued to move from city to city. I would have a good job from time to time, but I would do something to self-sabotage that situation, always reverting back to the mental illness that I had of borderline personality disorder. Never giving myself any structure, never giving myself any stability, and burning every bridge that I would come across because I didn't intend on keeping any kind of relationships for very long, because once I got what I wanted from you, I was ready to move on to the next person that I was going to manipulate to get what I needed from them. And so after years and years of partying and clubs and sleeping around, being very promiscuous, not respecting myself, not respecting my body, I went from cocaine on a daily basis and the ecstasy and then to the pain medicine and prescription pain medicine and prescription benzodiazepines like Xanax, to finally one day waking up and not having any money or any of these pills that I had had for a long, long time and had access to. And by then, I had moved myself back to Butler County after being gone for more than 10 years. I had sparked up some old friendships, old connections with people who also used drugs and also partied and also didn't care about choices that they made, just like I didn't care about choices that I made or how I affected anyone in my life. And I ended up going to an urgent care as part of my doctor shopping routine that I would do. I would frequent emergency rooms and things like that. But for some reason on this particular day, I decided to go to an urgent care in Middletown, Ohio. And even though they weren't going to give me a prescription of pain medicine, the nurse did give me a piece of paper, handwritten, with the name of a doctor in Hamilton, Ohio. And it was a pain medicine specialist. So I thought, okay, cool, I'll try this out, see what I can get from this guy. When I arrived to this doctor's office in Hamilton, Ohio, there was a line of people down the side of the building. And it still didn't click to me yet what was happening. So I went inside the building and I signed in, and they told me I needed to pay $400 in cash so that I could see the doctor. Well, being that I was a drug dealer, I happened to have $400 in cash. So I paid that, and thinking to myself, surely if I pay this much cash, I'm going to walk out with something worth my time and worth my money. Boy, was I right. I had hit the jackpot. I saw this doctor, and for the very first time I saw this doctor, I walked out with 60 more, prescriptions at least, for 60 morphine tablets and for 60 Percocet, 5 milligram. But he also gave me a prescription for a medication I'd never heard of, and it was called Opana ER. And Opana, come to find out, was an extended release form of Dilaudid, which is a very strong and potent, powerful medication, and on the market was comparable to OxyContin. This was in 2009, so this was before Purdue was ordered to reformulate OxyContin, and it was still a very popular drug at that time. And so when I got this prescription filled. I went to my hometown, Trenton, Ohio, and I went to a couple of my contacts and I said, I don't know what this is, but I know it's good. Let's get it on the street. What are we going to charge? And at that time, pills were going for $1 a milligram. And then if it was, a certain drug dealer, they would add on an additional $5 convenience fee. And so a 20 milligram Opana on the street now was $25 for one pill. Within 3 months, the entire town of Trenton was using Opana. And to this day, I feel responsible for that. I know dozens of people whose addiction started with one single pill called Opana. They're from Trenton. And I can't help but think that I'm partially responsible for that. After about 6 months of going to this one doctor, getting more and more prescriptions for these very powerful drugs, I was selling these medications because I had started to use heroin. The first time that I had ran out of pain medicine after seeing this doctor, I was experiencing what withdrawal felt like. I was vomiting, I had diarrhea, I was having cold sweats, my anxiety was 10 times what it normally was. I was dope sick. I had never been in withdrawal before. I had felt the mental withdrawal of the panic because I don't have my drugs. How am I going to get what I need? But I'd never felt the physical effects of withdrawal symptoms. I believe that because I was prescribed these very powerful pain medicines that I'd never taken before, the Opana, that raised the chemicals in my brain, that raised my tolerance, and that told my body, from now on, Amy, you need something much stronger than this. Vicodin and Percocet, they're not going to do it. And so my disease of addiction led me to make the choice to use heroin for the first time. The first time that I used it, I snorted it. And I could remember going back to when I was in the hospital with those kidney stones and what that injection felt like in my veins. And by snorting heroin, I didn't feel that, and I knew that that was what I was probably supposed to feel. And I was really disappointed, and I was kind of pissed off because I wanted to get high, and I wanted to get really high. And so I looked at the people that I was with. I still had some heroin left. They had needles. And I said, screw it, shoot me up. I didn't care that the needle was already used by someone else. The very first time I used IV heroin was with a dirty needle, without a second thought or concern. Because before I had used IV heroin, I had made the decision that I wasn't going to try to change my life. I was going to continue to go down that very dark and deep rabbit hole. And I was going to see where it gets me because I didn't care about my life. I didn't care where the disease of addiction was taking me because I wasn't an addict, or so that's what I understood. I didn't believe that I was an addict. I didn't believe I had a problem. I just knew I didn't care. I knew that I had walked away from the most important thing in my life. I knew that my family, even though they loved me, they didn't like me very much. And I didn't value loyalty or relationships with people because I couldn't manipulate someone that I cared about. I could, but then I would have to distance myself and separate myself so that that didn't weigh on my conscience as much as it should. So eventually I ended up committing some crimes to support my habit, and I had been charged with several felonies: felony robbery, felony breaking and entering, felony theft, felony receiving stolen property. And when I was arrested for these crimes, I went in front of Judge Wall in Middletown, who's no longer with us, and I pled not guilty. And I wanted to fight it because I knew that if I pled not guilty, that was my opportunity to run and not come back. And as I pled not guilty, I knew that the moment that I walked out of the courtroom, I wasn't going to come back until they caught me. And so I ended up going on the run. I found myself in Indianapolis. I was in a very abusive relationship that was controlling me because of my addiction. The man that I was with kept me consistently supplied with methadone or Dilaudid or Xanax or anything that I needed. But once that supply ran dry, I had to go back to what I knew best to do, which was to find heroin. I needed to find a dealer, and I needed to find a reliable dealer. I needed to find a dealer that was going to be able to front me when I didn't have the cash. I needed to make a rapport with a dealer, almost like a business relationship, because that's essentially what it was to me. I was the consumer, and that's where it went. I made contact with a young woman who was staying in a hotel that me and my abuser were staying in, and she happened to use heroin also. And the first time that I bought heroin from her was black tar heroin. I'd never done it before. I'd never seen it before. It was the best heroin I'd ever had in my life. This was in 2011. And the very next day, when I woke up in withdrawal, I had money, but I didn't have any connections for heroin. And so I went down to her room and knocked on her door, and she said, "Oh, lucky you, I'm getting ready to go and meet my dude right now. So why don't you just come with me?" Even better. So I went with her, got into her BMW, red convertible that was paid for by her sugar daddy, which I must say I was quite jealous of at the time. She had it made when it came to money and drugs. But as I got to know her a little better, there was so much pain behind her. It just makes me sad to think of those times. But through her, I was introduced to members of what I was told were Mexican cartel. And these men worked like it was a regular 9-to-5 job. I got a phone number from them the very next morning. I called and it went straight to voicemail, and it was about 8:30 in the morning. So I waited until 9 o'clock, and at 9:01 on the dot, I called again, and the phone number was working. It rang, and a Spanish gentleman answered the phone, and I said, "Hey, this is Amy, the redhead that you met yesterday. Can we meet up?" He told me where to go, and there I went. So I went to meet this gentleman and started a relationship of buying black tar heroin from the Mexican drug cartel. Over the course of the next 8 months or so, I would travel back and forth from Indianapolis to Detroit, or Indianapolis to Cincinnati, sometimes Chicago, and I would transport black tar heroin for Mexican drug cartel members. It was very scary, it was very risky, but they gave me a lot of free black tar heroin. It was cheaper than what I had been used to buying, and it was much stronger. But one day when I went to make my phone call, I wasn't able to get a hold of one of the dealers that I had been working with for several months. all day long, every 5 minutes, I called this number and it kept going to voicemail and it kept going to voicemail. And I was panicking. I had no other dealers. I had no other phone numbers. And I didn't have any money either, which usually wasn't a problem because they would give it to me and I would hustle for that whole day to come up with money for the next day to pay back what I had just got and then to pay for what I needed for that day. Several days have gone by at this point now that I'm not able to reach my dealers, and I am in serious withdrawal. The man that I was with at the time, my abuser, he then went and stole an entire prescription of Dilaudid tablets, and I decided that it was time to travel back to Ohio and see my family for the holidays. And so with all of that Dilaudid, I wasn't going to be, using heroin or using needles in front of my family. I wouldn't be in withdrawal, around my family. And so I could appear to them as if I was clean. If they didn't see any track marks in my arm, and if they didn't see me throwing up or very ill, then they would know that I was clean and I wasn't using anymore. And so 2 weeks go by and the Dilaudid runs out. And on New Year's Day in 2012, I woke up and I had some money from the holidays, and I contacted my best friend who I hadn't spoken to in a couple of years because I was on the run. And I contacted her and I drove to Middletown and I met with her and I got some heroin and I got some marijuana. And a couple of weeks later, I had decided that I wanted to try to get a hold of the Mexicans again. So I tried that phone number and it worked. Out of nowhere, it worked. Immediately, I needed to be back in Indianapolis because I needed the black tar heroin. And so I got a hold of a couple of childhood friends who all used, and I said, hey, I got a hold of my guy in Indianapolis. Let's get some money together and let's go to Indianapolis and get a bunch of black tar heroin and bring it back to Cincinnati and we can sell it and we can make a lot of money. And then we can go back and we can keep doing this for a while. So that's what we did. Except the last time that I traveled to Indianapolis with a friend of mine to get this black tar heroin, I ended up overdosing. Usually I would do just one balloon, which was how it was packaged in little tiny balloons. But this time I decided to do 2 balloons. I wanted to get extra high. And it was never a thought in my mind that I might overdose and die. That was never a thought. It was never a worry. It was never a concern. Because to me, if I died, great, it's over. I don't have to suffer anymore. My family doesn't have to watch this train wreck continue to happen and get their hopes up that I might change just to be sadly let down all over again. My daughter was better off without me coming in and out of her life. These were the things that I was thinking. It wasn't a fear that I would die. I wanted to die. I didn't want to be alive. I was suffering. And so I ended up overdosing, but when I woke up, I wasn't alone. I was around a bunch of strangers, but the people that I had traveled to Indianapolis with, they were nowhere around. I was in a car, the last thing I remembered. And I woke up and I was laying on the ground surrounded by EMS and police, or at least I think. It's still, very foggy. And they kept asking me, ma'am, what did you take? What did you take? What drugs are you on? What's your name? I told them an alias because I never used my real name. I didn't carry identification. And of course I told them that I didn't use anything. But they knew I had used something because they had administered naloxone, Narcan. And they had revived me with Narcan. And I decided that I didn't want to go to the hospital. I wasn't interested in getting help. All I wanted to do was to continue to do what I was doing and get high. And they took, the IV out of me. They took the stickers off of me. I didn't even sign my signature on the form to, tell them I didn't want treatment. I just simply made an X. I cried a little because I knew what I was doing. I knew I was walking away from where I had just died. And they wished me good luck, and I walked away, and I went and I sat on the curb. I didn't have a phone. I didn't have my purse. I didn't have any cigarettes. I was alone, trying to figure out what had just happened to me and trying to process everything. And realizing that I had just overdosed. How did I get there alone? My body was pushed out of the vehicle that I was in. People that I've known for years, people that I would never have thought would have pushed someone's overdosing body out of a vehicle so that they could leave and go get high. But the joke was on them because I still had all of the heroin in my pants. After I had injected my heroin, I had put more than 30 balloons of black tar heroin in a bag in my underwear to conceal it while we were about to travel back to Cincinnati. So I noticed that I had, this huge bag of heroin in my underwear. And the next thing I know, the car that I had ridden into Indianapolis was pulling up. They came back. But they didn't come back for me. They came back for the heroin. And I'm sure they didn't want me to know that. So they waved me over. I got into the car. And on the way back to Cincinnati, I didn't speak. I didn't say anything. I didn't tell them that I knew what they did. I just pretended that I didn't know what had happened. 6 weeks later, I was back in Indianapolis, staying in a hotel, and I had woken up sick for the last time. I had no money. I had no dope. I had no needles. And I was in an abusive relationship with another heroin addict. One of several things needed to happen right then and there. I needed to get help, and I needed to get out of this relationship, and I needed to get back to my family. I decided that no matter what it took that day, I was getting some help. And because I decided that I wanted to get some help, the man that I was with decided to beat the hell out of me. Because I think he knew that if I wasn't using anymore, he didn't have any control over me anymore. Well, later that day, I ended up going to a hospital emergency room, and I told them that I was suicidal and I had a plan to kill myself because I knew that by law, they had to admit me. Luckily for me, they had a behavioral unit that was dual diagnosis for mental health and for substance use disorder. 48 hours after I was admitted, I was given Suboxone, the medication called buprenorphine, but the brand name is Suboxone. Within a few hours, I was able to participate in group therapy. I was able to be honest with the counselors and express that I didn't want to live this life anymore. I didn't want to be who I had become anymore. I was tired of it. And I wanted to change. I wanted my soul back. And so for the next 6 months, I decided that I was going to leave that man and I was going to come back to Ohio and I was going to build my life back. And that's exactly what I did. And so I got very fortunate that towards the end of 2012, the man I was in a relationship with had beaten me so severely and had strangled me that I was able to call 911 and he was arrested and I got away. So I came back to Ohio and I came right back to Middletown, which was where I had been using, which is where the heroin addiction began in the first place, which is where all of my connections were. But I had already made that decision that I was done with that life. I was done with that drug. I was done with all drugs. I was ready to be someone else. And I moved in with a friend of mine. I was very surprised to meet a wonderful man. I wasn't looking to meet anyone. I was, very serious about working on myself. But I think that's when the best relationships happen, or when we're not looking for them. And at least that's what he says too. And his name is Jeremy. And we fell in love very quickly. We got an apartment together. And just about maybe 5 or 6 weeks after we got an apartment together, in the town that I had several felony warrants out for my arrest in, we heard a knock at the door, and it was Middletown police. They weren't coming for me, but they left with me. I was arrested and was initially booked in for 90 days for a probation violation. I had only been arraigned for all of my felony charges, so I still had to go to court for all of those. And when I was arrested and booked into Middletown City Jail, I was the only female that was not going through severe withdrawal from opioids. I had been clean for just a little more than a year at that point. But because I was there for all of these felony warrants, I had to prepare myself that I was going to go to prison. And I was terrified. I had been an atheist all my life. I had never felt a real connection to God or a higher power. I didn't believe that it was for me, and I didn't believe it was real. But as I'm sitting in the jail cell in Middletown, desperate and ashamed, terribly sad that I had finally found a wonderful man, finally had fallen in love, and my past had come back. And I needed to answer to my past. And I was desperate, and I had never tried this before, and the only book that was in my cell was a Bible. So I said, why not? Can't hurt, right? I opened the Bible, and I don't believe I did this. I believe that it was the work of God. But when I opened the Bible, it automatically turned to Proverbs 31:25, and that was the very first verse that I had read. It says that she is clothed in strength and dignity, and she laughs without fear of the future. And at that moment, I had a spiritual awakening. I knew without a doubt that Jesus was my Savior. I knew without a doubt that no matter what I was about to face in my life, it was all going to be okay, because that's what was meant to happen. I let go and I let God. And I'd never understood what that meant before. I never understood what that phrase meant, to let go and let God. I stopped trying to control everything that happened in my life, because obviously that wasn't working very well for me for so many years. And I decided that no matter what happened to me, I was going to be just fine, because there was a purpose for me to be alive. I should be dead, and I'm alive for a reason. I went to court, and I had been in jail for 10 days at that point, and I went to court and I went in front of Judge Wall, and he dismissed every felony charge. He took it off. He took me off of probation. He saw something within me. And again, the work of God. It had to be. I can't explain it otherwise. And I walked out of that courtroom with no probation, no felony, and $595 in fines. That was the pivotal moment in my life. I went home to the man that I'd fallen in love with, and I started to figure out how I was going to build my life. You know, I'd been clean for a year, but I'd only been clean. I wasn't in recovery. I wasn't doing anything to help my wellness, you know, my mental health, my anxiety, my physical health. I wasn't doing anything to help any of that. And because I wasn't doing anything to help any of that, because I wasn't having continued therapy or aftercare or anything, I sunk further into a depression. And because Jeremy, you know, who'd never been in trouble, never had issues with addiction, he'd never really gone through periods of depression or anything, he didn't understand what I was going through, and I was dragging him down. And we separated. And it was the hardest thing I'd ever gone through. But it was the best thing I'd ever gone through, because in that time of separation, I found myself. I started doing yoga. I started meditating. I started working on myself. I started working on everything that had traumatized me. The reason that I started using in the first place, I started identifying my emotions. I started to change how my brain operated. I started to change how I perceived things, how I reacted and responded to things. I was always a very negative and argumentative and agitated kind of a person. And I didn't want to be like that anymore. And so from that point on, I decided that I was going to be so positive and full of sunshine that it would make people just sick. And you know, consistently doing that and consciously making that effort to find the silver lining and find the positive in every situation, it changed me. It changed everything about me. It made me encouraging, you know, and because I made all of those changes, and because I decided, you know, I want to work in the field of addiction, I want to help people, I went back to school and, well, it was online courses, of course, but I became a certified chemical dependency counselor assistant. I rekindled the relationship with Jeremy. We very quickly got pregnant. I got pregnant. And life became something like a dream. I continued to advance my education and my certifications and licensing within the field. I gave birth to my beautiful little girl, who is now 2.5 years old. I was able to build back a relationship with my oldest daughter, who I'd signed my rights away to. And I started to do public speaking. I started to share my story in front of people. I started being offered opportunities to come and speak to, you know, different areas of this field. Not just people who are in treatment, but I was speaking to families. I was speaking to government officials, public safety meetings regarding syringe exchange services and things like that. My whole goal was to break stigma. You know, that what if it was your loved one who had fallen on hard times or had become injured and was overprescribed pain medicine, or however the disease of addiction developed. But it's a disease of addiction. You know, it is a disease. And that became my sole purpose in life, was to show the world, you know, that I am someone important. I am someone that is amazing. I am someone that is inspiring. And I thank God that I am a person with substance use disorder. I feel lucky that I am a person who has struggled and battled and has survived things like suicide attempts and overdoses and physical abuse. I've been stabbed. I've been raped. I have been terrified to turn a corner. And here I am today, living a beautiful life as a certified peer recovery counselor. I have a beautiful, happy, and healthy marriage. I have a beautiful relationship with my oldest daughter, and God gave me the chance to have another child so that I can be the mother to her that I was supposed to be with my oldest daughter. But now I'm able to be all of these wonderful things that I never imagined in my life I would be or even could be. I've been able to hold public events and community events to raise money for services that help people within community. I've been able to form relationships with really important people within the Cincinnati area. I've been fortunate to appear on the news several times, and I've had several articles written about me. I've been fortunate to be part of documentaries. I even got to fly out to Washington, D.C. and go to the CNN studios for a town hall meeting with several senators. And I even got to meet Senator Bernie Sanders. It was very embarrassing. I humiliated myself, but it's a great story. I'm just really proud of the person that I am today. I'm thankful that I get to tell my story. I'm very thankful that I understand who I am, where I've been, how I got here, and how I can take everything from my past and empower myself with my mistakes, with my choices. And I can show others that recovery is possible. If you or a loved one are going through substance use disorder, you can get help. There's help out there. There's medication. There's therapy. You don't have to be ashamed. And I always tell family members, we have to love people through this. Don't ever lose hope, because if you lose hope, then what? What comes after losing hope? I don't want to think about that. We all need to come together and understand that addiction and mental illness isn't a moral failing. It's a disease. It's something that no one is immune to. It's something that is not prejudiced to anyone for any reason, and that we all deserve a second chance in life to find recovery and to be happy and healthy.